And now it is my great pleasure to introduce Karalyn Patterson, our visiting scholar. Karalyn was born and raised in the U.S., but she's lived in and worked in Cambridge, England long enough to develop and cultivate this lovely accent that you'll have the pleasure of listening to in a few minutes. Karalyn holds the position of senior scientist at the Cognition and Brain Sciences Unit in Cambridge, England, which, if you don't know it, is one of the foremost centers for cognitive neuroscience and neurorehabilitation in the world. Her resume lists numerous honorary professorial posts in universities and hospitals throughout the UK, as well as visiting research positions in Tokyo, Sydney, and Paris. We often say in a sort of perfunctory manner that someone's research has had an international scope, but in this case that's very true. Now, among her many honors, Karalyn is a fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences and past president of the British Neuropsychological Society. She's inspired and mentored students and fellows who, like her, have gone on to become leaders in the field of cognitive neuroscience. But her inspiration has reached well beyond that. Just to give one notable example, the work in my lab, for example, would look very different if it hadn't been for the model that Karalyn set. And I want to just tell you a few elements of what that model is as I interpret it. Karalyn's approach to neuropsychology starts with careful, detailed investigation of individuals with neuropsychological deficits as a means of understanding the cognitive impairments they present with. Proceeds to replication of the observations across many different patients with the same etiology, building the insights that emerge from that case series approach, as it's come to be called, building those observations into a comprehensive theoretical model that's capable of generating new predictions, which she then always goes on to test. And finally, relating these observations and models to the structure and organization of the brain using a variety of neuroimaging techniques. In the hands of Karalyn and her collaborators, this approach has brought forth the most sophisticated model of reading that we have in the field today, and it has completely changed the landscape of research on progressive dementia and the semantic deficits that often accompany them. And this latter topic is what Karalyn will be talking about today. Her talk is entitled Beyond the Scores, Clues to the Nature of Semantic Disorders from the Things Patients Say and Do. Please welcome Karalyn Patterson.
Thank you very much. It's really a great pleasure and honor to be here, to be a visiting scholar. Okay, beyond the scores. Now, I do research, of course, as we all do in this room, and but I'm not really going to talk to you about the research that I do, in a sense, today. So this is an unusual talk. Instead of telling you, as people normally do in talks, about the results of investigations and experiments and imaging and, you know, various techniques that we use and so on, I'm going to talk about the things that patients say and do in real life or in the clinic or in testing situations that are not actually part of the testing or part of our formal evaluation of them, but that I think are really informative about their impaired abilities. And the reason I can do this is that for a number of years now, I've worked very closely with neurologists in the medical school in Cambridge who welcome me into the clinic. And when the patients and their families are being interviewed by the neurologist in charge of the clinic, I'm given the great privilege of sitting in the corner, allowed from time to interject something if I have a question to ask, but really listening and observing. And it's such a privilege to be able to do this. And I feel I've learned so much, some of it very painful because, as you'll know, these are painful disorders, but really so gripping. And these opportunities have raised all sorts of questions in my mind that I think are challenging for all of us to think about. And the reason I've decided to talk to you about these things today is the research mostly gets written up and submitted and published, not all of it, of course, but the majority of it. I'm under no delusions about how much people read the papers that get published in the literature, but the point is the research is available out there for anybody to read if they really want to. But these sorts of observations are the sorts of things we never do publish, and I feel they're really valuable for us to think about. Okay, so what I'm going to do is kind of go through a series of examples, and the structure of each example is as follows. First of all, I'll tell you what the context was, that is, what was the patient doing, how were we able to be aware of what the patient, what was happening, then what the actual observation is, what did the patient say or do in this situation in response to what was going on, and then to think about what the message is, that is, what can we learn from this response. And sometimes I'll mention some formal testing that corroborates this message, although all of the examples themselves will not be from formal testing situations. And I should emphasize that in general, I think the formal and the informal messages are really not discrepant. That is, it's not that what we're seeing in the patient's behavior in all of these examples in any way contradicts what we would find if we were doing formal testing. It's just that such observations can kind of encapsulate a point or serve to make us think about the ways our research should move, because often these are things that we haven't actually incorporated into our formal testing. The patients that I'll be talking about in these various examples are mostly patients with semantic dementia, but a couple of the examples come instead from semantically impaired cases with Alzheimer's disease. And as many of you will know who see these types of patients, there are some very interesting similarities and differences between SD and AD. Just to remind you, I'm sure most of you could give this part of the talk yourselves, but just to remind you the way I and our research group, and I think most people in the world who think about semantic dementia or see cases like this think about it, is that it's a central semantic conceptual disorder. It affects all modalities of input and output. It affects virtually all forms of knowledge, Now, this is something I've discussed with a few of you in our conversations earlier in the day. There does seem to be an apparent order of severity, either to be observed cross-sectionally if you see mild, moderate, and severe patients, or if you catch the patients early enough. And the shocking thing in a way to me is that very often we don't catch them that early. The insidious nature of the onset of this kind of condition is such that by the time the patients at least get to the clinic where we see them, they're surprisingly advanced. It's really rather shocking how late it can be before they come to appropriate medical attention. Although, since there's no treatment for these diseases, in a way you could say it doesn't matter that much. But anyway, either cross-sectionally or longitudinally, there is an apparent order of severity in this disorder, so that it seems to be either the first or always the worst is expressive language. That's where the most obvious deficits are, followed by receptive language, followed by nonverbal forms of conceptual knowledge, object recognition, and use. Now, some people have taken this, this observation is not original with me or with our group. A number of people have commented on it, and other investigators have taken this to indicate that the disease itself is changing over a period of time. That is, it's kind of growing in its scope. I have a slightly different view of what's happening, and I think a lot of this apparent order of severity is actually explicable in terms of two things. One is the task demands. the kinds of tests that we use to explore expressive language, receptive language, and object recognition or use really make differential demands on the patient's knowledge. And secondly, by the nature of peripheral central mappings. Words and objects really have very, very different mappings to their meanings. So if you look at words like fox and box, they're pretty similar. But if you look at the actual fox and the actual box, they're so dissimilar. There are so many cues in the sorts of shapes and the relationship amongst parts between living things and non-living things, for example. So I think that explains a great deal of why the apparent order of severity is that understanding objects appears, the deficit there appears to come later, but I'm not really sure that it does come later. All right, so let me begin with the various examples. So here is the context. We were seeing a patient and we said to her, please name this. And she said, it's a horse, ain't it? And then she pointed to the stripes on this horse and said, but what are these funny things for? Now, maybe some of you who work with stroke patients will tell me that I'm wrong, but from the days when I did see a lot of stroke patients, I don't think you would ever see this kind of response from an anomic stroke patient. To me, this indicates that the naming, the anomia in semantic dementia is not word-finding difficulty. It's not that this patient is having trouble finding the word zebra. She doesn't know what it is. Those stripes no longer signify for her. All she can do is react to it in terms of a more prototypical animal that looks something like this. But of course, if you thought it was a horse, why would it have those funny things on it? And I think our formal testing really corroborates this sort of message. There is such a high degree of consistency across occasions and across types of testing to suggest that the naming problem is just one indication of a central semantic disorder. It's really, I'm not even sure we should call it anomia. Here's another example, the context. The patient AM and his wife, this is reported to us later by his wife, get out of their car into the pouring rain. Pours pretty often in Britain. And she hands him an umbrella. And what does he do with the umbrella? She tells us later, it's not been opened. It's still furled rather than unfurled. And he holds it above his head in this furled state without opening it. The first message from this to me is that semantic dementia is not a language disorder. She wasn't asking him what this thing was called. She was giving it to him in the way you would give an umbrella to anybody in the pouring rain, and this is what he does with it. The second thing is how graded and partial the deterioration of semantic memory is. He somehow knows that he should put it above his head. I mean, it's just sort of like a stick, you know. But he somehow knows that this belongs in a position above his head, but of course it's completely non-functional unless you open it up. Context. Bruce and his wife are driving through the countryside. They're going to visit a friend of his, and it's a number of years since they've been to visit this friend. And his wife tells us later, he says to her, remember, you have to turn into that small place up ahead. They're coming along the main road, and there's a smaller road that they need to turn into to continue on their journey to this friend's house. And this is correct. And his wife is very surprised because, in fact, she hadn't remembered that they need to make this turning in order to continue on their journey. And so she thinks, wow, he really knows a lot. And then a few minutes later, he says to her, what are those things? And he's pointing to a flock of sheep in a field. Now, I don't know how many of you have ever driven around the countryside in Britain. Seeing a flock of sheep in a field is about as common as, you know, walking along a city street and seeing somebody walking a dog. Sheep are absolutely everywhere. And she says to him, what are those things? after he has told her in advance that they need to turn into this road up ahead. So to me, this raises a couple of messages and a couple of questions. Part of the message is the selectivity of the disorder. His visuospatial skills are really unimpaired, and at least this aspect of episodic memory is really unimpaired. He remembers much better than she does what route they have to take to visit this friend. Again, this very profound anomia, but really it's a profound agnosia. He's not asking her what those things are called, really. He's asking her what those things are. And partly why I find this so interesting is the question that, this is a slightly cryptic way of putting the question, when we ask these patients to name objects or pictures in our formal tests, I think the task demands of the test itself require them to try to give a response. And so, if shown a picture of a zebra, or possibly even a sheep, what is the patient likely to say? Something like, it's a horse, or it's an animal. But note that Bruce didn't say to his wife, what are those animals, or what are those horses? He said, what are those things? I really think that, you know, the profound loss of knowledge is such that unless you're being required to try to come up with some response that satisfies the demands of the situation, on the whole, what the patients say is, I don't know what that is. The context, sometimes, although less often than we used to, because the patients hate it so much. In the early days, we sort of felt we needed to explore the range of what they could and what they couldn't do, and so we asked them to do a lot of things they really didn't like doing. We don't do this so much anymore, but we used to ask them to define words and concepts and objects and so on. So we say to this patient, what's a seahorse? And he says, oh, I didn't know they had horses in the sea. What's the message here? A couple of things. The deterioration of knowledge is so strongly predicted by familiarity and or age of acquisition, and also by typicality. The result of that is something like seahorse, which is low familiarity or late age of acquisition, and also is a very atypical animal, is no longer even a unified concept to him. The only way he can respond to this is to take it apart into the two bits that he does still know and say, I didn't know they had horses in the sea. And everything in our formal testing sort of fits with this powerful effects of both familiarity and typicality. Context, we're asking a patient to name pictures of animals, patient DG in this instance, and she names dog, cat, and horse correctly. And that's all. We gave her all, I don't know how many animals there are in the Snodgrass full 200 and whatever it is, 56 pictures. There are a lot. We asked her to name all of the animals in the Snodgrass set. These are the only ones she got correct. All of these, pig, squirrel, sheep, deer, goat, fox, etc., she called a dog. Mouse, rabbit, and monkey, she called a cat. Lion, zebra, rhino, and bear, she called horse. Seahorse, there's that seahorse again, though remember now it's a picture rather than the word. She said, oh, that's a little thing. The fish and the frog, she said, I don't know. The message about this to me is that typicality not only predicts which responses will be correct, but also the nature of the errors. Animals that have 4 legs and a body and a face and ears and 2 eyes and so on are all typical enough that they can kind of fall into the attractor basins of these typical animals, dog, cat, and horse, which are the 3 that she gets correct. And they are not only her 3 correct responses, they are her 3 default responses to all of these other things that have a lot of feature overlap with them. But when we come to things like seahorse or fish or frog, they are so atypical, they can't be captured by these prototypical responses, and all she can say is, it's a little thing, or I don't know. Again, DG naming pictures of animals. Mouse, rabbit, and monkey, remember, she calls cat. Pig, sheep, deer, goat, kangaroo, she calls dog. Rhino, lion, zebra, bear, she calls horse. Anybody noting anything about this? It looks as if the errors partially respect the size of the animal in real life. And here's the puzzle about this to me. I honestly don't know, and I haven't figured out a good experimental way to find out, is the size information in the stimulus or is it in the patient? And the reason for that is, if you look at the Snodgrass pictures of the pig and the rhino, they're not all that different in size. So that might make you think that the information is in the patient. On the other hand, I'm not entirely convinced. There might be clues to the size of the animal in things like the ratio of the, the width of the leg to the size of the depicted body. I genuinely don't know whether we're, even in these pictures that have been sort of fixed to be a pretty common size, whether there might be clues about the real life size. I was going to say, please interrupt or ask questions at any point, but now I remember you're not supposed to, so you're all being very nice and obedient and quiet. Context. We're having a conversation in the clinic. JRH is John Hodges, the neurologist with whom I've done most of this work over many years. And John says to the patient, how do you spend your time during the days? And the patient says, I'm very good at these 11,000 things which you put all together to make. Anybody know what he's? And it's really true. We have finally managed to do a sort of experimental study of jigsaw puzzle behavior in it. A number of these patients are, I would call it something close to an addiction. They spend sometimes up to 8 hours a day doing jigsaw puzzles. And there is something about the combination of skills required to do a jigsaw puzzle that seems to fit the retained cognitive aspects of semantic dementia incredibly well. And I think we understand some aspects of this because their visuospatial skills are so good, their color matching is very good, and of course what you need to do a jigsaw puzzle is to put together pieces that both fit spatially but also usually have some color overlap. Here's an interesting thing about this jigsaw puzzle use. We were talking to another patient, another jigsaw addict, about the puzzle he was currently doing, and John said to him, what's it a picture of? And he said, I don't know, I didn't look. Context. This same patient, AT, who explained to us how good he was at the 11,000, it's a bit of an overestimate for most jigsaw puzzles, but he's just been doing some mental arithmetic, and he's very good at it, and we comment on how well he's done it. And he says, yes, that seems to work okay, that's the odd thing. Not everything is off. Some things are so awful, and yet other things will look all right. And again, the message of this to me is the selectivity of the disorder. But there are some really interesting questions. Why are numbers special? I said at the beginning that semantic dementia seemed to affect all aspects of knowledge. It's not complete, number knowledge is not completely immune. And we know a lot more about this than we did even a few years ago, because there have been a couple of recent papers by the Manchester group, Julie Snowden and David Neary, really trying to pin down what these patients do and don't know about numbers and how to manipulate them and how to do arithmetic operations and so on. And it's not true that it's completely normal, but it is somewhat spared, especially for addition and subtraction. Multiplication and division are much more complicated, but for addition and subtraction, and for at least for single-digit numbers, they really are very, very good at it. And I'm not sure that we entirely understand why. Oh, you know, there are easy answers like, oh, number knowledge is in the left parietal lobe, and semantic dementia patients have atrophy in the front of the temporal lobe, and so, but I don't think, you know, that's a very satisfactory, complete answer. So, why are numbers special? What aspects of number knowledge are preserved in semantic dementia? And is good digit span attributable to content? I think this is a really interesting question. The first semantic dementia patient I ever saw was already so severe that she never named a single object in our presence, not even cat, dog, fork, any common thing. She never named anything. She was so advanced. She had a forward digit span of 9 and a backward digit span of 6. And to me, this was just... And the first time I gave a talk on this patient, and it was very early in my days of studying semantic dementia, somebody called John Marshall, whom Brennan knew very well. Some of the rest of you may at least know his name from the early studies he did of deep and surface dyslexia and so on. The first time I talked about this, John happened to be in the audience, and he said, is this a category-specific short-term memory effect, preservation of, you know, this one category within verbal working memory? And, you know, this question absolutely floored me, but I'm not sure that he wasn't right. I don't know that their working memory is normal except for numbers. Now, I want to contrast some semantically impaired AD patients at this point, because I'm going to start with something to do with number knowledge. So John Hodges and I are doing an informal assessment in the clinic with, on different occasions, a couple of patients that we're pretty sure, well, post-mortem for at least one of them we now know had Alzheimer's disease, but with a lot of semantic involvement. In the other case, we didn't get the brain donation, so we don't know. So John says to one of the patients, if you ordered a pint of beer in the pub and it cost £2.50 and you gave the barman £10, how much change would you get? And DCJ says, he pauses for a minute and he says, oh, I wouldn't give as much as that. So John says, okay, suppose the beer costs £2.50 and you give him £5. Pretty easy mental arithmetic. Again, DCJ pauses for a long time and then he says, I don't drink beer. Another example. We're talking to patient JC who's divorced, and John says to him, how long have you been on your own? And JC says, oh, have I got to go back about 3,000 years? John's a little later in the conversation says, when is your birthday? And JC says, I forget. I wish you people had told me before I got here that you were going to try to ask these sorts of questions. So John says, let me put it another way. What year were you born? And JC says, well, I wasn't very old at the time, so I didn't sort of get it. The message, I think, is the AD patients are much worse than the SD patients at number skills, but they're so good at trying to get around the questions. This is my favorite one, I think. I don't drink beer. I can't be expected to know how much change I'd get paying for a pint of beer. Context, please name this. Now we're back to an SD patient. AM. He says, it's in that country down in Africa, in the upper right-hand corner. I can show you on my thing over there. And there is indeed a globe in his living room at home where we're testing him. And he's pointing the globe, and he's already said that it's in the upper right-hand corner down in Africa. He can't name it. There are lots of people who could name it who wouldn't be able to tell you that, you know, that is in the upper right-hand corner of Africa, down in Africa. The message is that there seems to be a kind of shred of preservation of geographical knowledge in these patients, and if there is, even more so than the number knowledge, I really don't know why. I don't know why somebody should be able to, you know, and this is a pretty abstract representation of a pyramid, but conversation or informal assessment in the clinic. John says to the patient, "Where does your daughter work?" And he says, "At the University of," starts with an M, that big important one in the north of England. I love telling this story to my colleagues from the University of Manchester because they're so thrilled that, you know, he thinks it's that big important one in the north of England. Of course, his daughter does work there, so maybe that's why it's so important in his world. This was in about 2005. John says to one of our patients, "Who's the US president?" And he says, "It's such a short name. I don't know. Does it begin with B?" So the message here seems to be that occasionally, at least, there is some preservation of initial letter or sound knowledge in these patients. And the reason I find this so puzzling is these are not like stroke-aphasic patients. They do not benefit from phonological cueing. We did some gating experiments some years ago with a couple of SD patients where they would be looking at a picture of an object that they can't name, and the gating technique, you know, you give them initially, I think, 100 milliseconds worth of a burst of the sound of the spoken word, and then you incrementally add bits and see at what point the person can actually. Now, of course, in normal subjects, when you do this, you don't have a picture there, or else they wouldn't need any of the phonological information. But with the patients, you're adding gradually the amount of phonological information to the presence of the picture. And it's absolutely staggering. In general, the patients do not get the name until they have reached or gone past the uniqueness point, the recognition point of that spoken word. And sometimes they get to the full word, and they're sort of repeating what they've just heard, but it's as if it's not really making contact. So I'm really astounded on these occasions when the patients seem to have some awareness of what a little bit of the word starts with or sounds like. Context, conversations in clinic. So here's our patient IF, and he's talking about his current difficulties. And we've asked him what's troubling him, and he says, "Well, some of my friends have given myself away from them because I can't talk to them," which is a really heartbreaking thing to say. But the point of my example is, it's a little odd, his expression. Here's another example. JW is talking about the pub where he has his meals, and he says, "It's very nice, and the steak and kidney pie is only £4. And John Hodges says, "Do you always have that?" He says, "Not every day, but ever such a lot. I do have other ones, you know, what they put certain things up." Slightly funny expression. Here's a third example, JB talking about his problems. He says, "I want to say you right now that this is what's wrong with me." And all of these questions, all of these expressions make me wonder, and this is going to be part, for those of you who are going to be at the Mir Safran conference tomorrow, this is one of the topics I'll be talking about. Is syntax really unimpaired in these patients, and is it really, as some models would have it, independent of semantics? Conversation in clinic. John Hodges just asked about the patient's problems, and he says, "I'm playing golf next week, for example, in an annual syndicate competition we have with people I used to work with, and at the moment I can't remember a single name of them." To me, the message here is the impact of concept level. Usually in semantic dementia, the pattern we observe as the disorder progresses is that The specific information is the most vulnerable, followed by sort of intermediate levels, and what's preserved for longest is the most general level. And what could be more specific than individual people and their names? So it's not surprising, I think, that people and their names are so vulnerable. The patients often describe it as having trouble retrieving the name of the person, and they don't so much describe it as a problem with knowing who it is, but I'm not convinced. And I also don't know really yet the extent to which this is just a specificity effect, and we can explain all of their problems with people and their names in terms of people, or whether it's whether people are special or whether it's just a specificity effect. And there's also an issue here. I'm sure many of you know that it's always a bilateral disease, but often, at least early on, it can be very asymmetric. And it is true that we tend to see more problems with people, knowing people and naming people in the patients who have the less common version of the asymmetry, that is more atrophy in the right than in the left. This is a very interesting example. We've had reports from the wives of 3 of our male SD patients along these lines. One patient started to ask his wife, "What is this funny stuff that keeps growing on my face?" And 2 of the patients continued to shave their faces, but they also began to shave the hair on other parts of their bodies. I was really stunned when I heard about this. But if you think about it, you know, beards are a pretty specific level of the semantic system. And it's only by convention that you shave your hair here, but not here or not here. It's really, in a way, if part of the semantic disorder is a loss of the ability to distinguish between similar things, perhaps it's not that surprising that, you know, if you think you should shave this, then maybe you should shave other things as well. So this aspect of semantic memory in its role in generalization and differentiation. Context. We all do category fluency with patients. One of you was telling me earlier today about asking a member of her family to do fluency for different types of soup. This person claiming that he knew dozens and dozens of types of soup, and when she asked him in a minute to name all these soups, wasn't that easy. But we do test our patients on what we call cat flu, category fluency. It's a slightly flippant name, I'm sorry. After we had bird flu, I thought we ought to have cat flu, but it really means category fluency. Okay, please tell me the names of as many animals as you can think of. And the patient said, dog, cat. Cloud died 3 weeks ago. Cloud is their dog. This is something a normal person or even other kinds of aphasic patients, I don't think, you know, I can't swear to it, but I've never seen this behavior in anything other than semantic dementia. The message to me is that recent autobiographical events become so salient for SD patients that they actually, I think, start to invade their general knowledge. So knowledge is no longer something that you share with everybody else. It's your own personal experience. Conversation in clinic. John says to the patient, "What do you do in the day?" He says, "I take our dog for a walk." "What kind of dog do you have?" "A Rhodesian Ridgeback." I'm sitting in the corner taking notes. I nearly fell off my chair when this patient says a Rhodesian Ridgeback. Do you know what a Rhodesian Ridgeback is? It's, you know, it's a breed of dog. It's huge, and it has a ridge down its back. And they're South Africa. They're originally from South Africa, but there are a number of them in Britain. And I'm just completely astounded by this man's ability to say this low frequency, unfamiliar term that for many people wouldn't even signify as a dog, but he immediately tells us his dog is a Rhodesian Ridgeback. But I shouldn't have fallen off my chair yet. Better is to come, because John says, do you have any cats? And he says, cats. I'm not sure what those are. The combination of being able to say Rhodesian Ridgeback and not knowing what a cat is just so incredible. And the message here is the facilitation, even of very low frequency, low familiarity items and terms from personal exposure, familiarity, usage. This man is so gregarious. He was a stockbroker pre-morbidly, and he still talks like one, talks a mile a minute, and he's always, he takes his dog for a walk multiple times a day, and I'm sure he's telling everybody and anybody he meets is a little disinhibited that he has a Rhodesian Ridgeback. That term is so frequent and familiar in his vocabulary, whereas cats are... But the interesting thing is, and this is another thing I was discussing with some of you earlier, that it needs this frequency of usage needs to be recent and regular. So one of our patients some years ago was a surgeon, and he had sort of diagnosed, I mean, he didn't know it was semantic dementia, but he had detected his own problem because in surgery he was having a lot of difficulty naming the instruments that he wanted the surgical nurse to hand to him, and he was really worried about this. And we tested him, now this is a few years, not that many, but a few years after he'd retired. Not only couldn't he name the surgical instruments, he couldn't even do the word-picture matching. We made up special word-picture matching tests for him, with names of surgical instruments and pictures of the various ones, and he couldn't. That information, which was, of course, not familiar to most people, what was highly familiar in his professional life, was really lost. We had a chemist who couldn't tell us what an element was. We had a psychiatrist who it was very interesting to test him because we could give him all sorts of, we know a little bit more about psychiatry than we do about chemistry and surgery. So we gave him names and words to read like these. And he said this was Jung, this was Freud, and this was placebo. So, Oh, what was the... Oh, this was really kind of the importance of the conversation we were having earlier. What is this impact of frequent use and encountering of objects and terms? What is it an impact on? Is it really kind of boosting and preserving the concept itself, or is it really a different kind of knowledge, a sort of procedural activity that has become very, very frequent, and when you no longer are engaged in that, it's lost? I'm really, there's some debate about this in the literature, and I'm not sure. It doesn't have to be one or the other, of course, it could be some of both. Conversation followed by definitions, because we have picked up this very interesting phenomenon. So John says to this patient, what sort of work did you do? And he says, I commanded a team on bulk petroleum. We wait 5 to 10 minutes, and then we say to the patient, petroleum, can you say that? No trouble repeating, he says petroleum. What is petroleum? Long pause, then hesitantly. Something that uses petrol? Now, this is not a good definition of petroleum at all. He is the one who has told us, I commanded a team on bulk petroleum. We have not pulled this word out of our vocabulary to give him to define. He's produced it. But does he know what it means when he's not producing this highly familiar phrase, I commanded a team on bulk petroleum? DV telling us about his big trees in his garden with something on them to eat. And he says, but last year we didn't have anything on 4 of the trees because we had a late frost. Again, we wait 5 to 10 minutes, And we say, what does frost mean? And he says, frost, frost. What's that? Again, he has just produced this word. And the message, I think, is this lack of generalization between contexts. These patients have a certain number of topics they can talk about. They have, I don't know that they're set phrases in the sense that they will be completely identical on every occasion, although I bet they're pretty similar on different occasions. But if you take that word out of context and give it to them when they haven't just been talking about petroleum or frost, it's not clear that they really know. So the words they use frequently can really mislead us into thinking that they know more than they do. Here's the best example yet in the domain of language. In another moment, I'm going to give you an example out of the domain of language. This is our ex-stockbroker, the one with the Rhodesian Ridgeback. He's a huge football fan. He always watches football matches on television, and he goes to football matches if he can. It is the national sport in Britain. It's British, European football, which is soccer. Anyway, so he's telling us about there's just been a big football match involving the team that he supports. And he says to us, it's wonderful, my friend, to have a 60-minute entertainment, and if your team wins or loses, you'll be euphoric or suicidal, but by the next day, I'm thinking, this is sort of like the Rhodesian Ridgeback example, I'm thinking, euphoric? Don't you know you have semantic dementia? How can you produce this extremely low frequency word? So, sure enough, we wait 5 to 10 minutes, and then I say to him, Mr. B, what does euphoric mean? And he says, phoric. Phoric. I like to phoric. Euphoric, iphoric. Not only doesn't he know what it means, he cannot even parse it. It has become a verb. I like to phoric. He has produced this word. And I said to his wife afterwards, does he, when he talks about football, does he often say this thing about euphoric or suicidal? She says, oh yes, always. That's his standard phrase. You know, at the moment when he produces it, sometimes I think we shouldn't wait 5 minutes. We should interrupt, 500 milliseconds after he said it. I just honestly do not know. At that moment, is there some connection, or is it really just what he's been saying for 30 years about football matches? I don't know, and I'm not sure how to find out. This facilitation by recent, regular, specific experience is not confined to words. And here's my star example out of the context of words. This is something I heard about from a neurologist in Barcelona at a conference I was at in Spain. She said, and she was telling us that a number of their patients do Sudoku puzzles, and ours do too. More of ours do Jigsaw puzzles, but some of them do Sudoku. In fact, one of our relatively still mild patients not only does Sudoku puzzles, he makes them up, he makes new ones, which is pretty amazing, given that he has semantic dementia. So here's the story about this patient. You all know what Sudoku is, I take it. Okay. So when this neurologist first saw the patient, he reported, and his wife reported, that his daily routine is he gets up in the morning, he throws on some old clothes, he goes out to the newsagent, he buys his daily newspaper, he comes back, and he does the Sudoku puzzle. And until he has done that Sudoku puzzle, nothing else can capture his attention. He won't have his shower or get properly dressed or have his coffee or his breakfast. Sudoku is his morning routine. So the next time the patient came to clinic, which was like 6 months or a year later, the neurologist thought, I'd really like to observe this. And I'm exactly the same. I was so eager to see a patient doing Sudoku, because to me it's sort of I know it's numbers, and I know they're all single-digit numbers, and I know you don't need to know even what the numbers mean. You just need to know that you can't have repetitions of any number in the row or column or square. But still, it seems pretty complex to me. Anyway, she decides she wants to watch him doing Sudoku. So she has brought in one of the magazines you can get with Sudoku puzzles. So she brings it out and she shows it to him. And he says, "What's this?" And she says, "You know, you do these all the time." And he says, "I have no idea what this is." And she says, "Well, here's the instructions. Can you read the instructions?" Thinking, you know, this will sort of remind him of. And he reads the instructions and he still says, "I have no idea what this is all about." So she thinks, okay, you know, even these sort of hobbies, activities, procedural knowledge eventually decline as the patients get more severe. And she thinks, okay, since I last saw him, he stopped doing Sudoku. So after she's finished interviewing the patient, she goes into the room next door to talk to his wife and says, "I see your husband doesn't do Sudoku anymore." And the wife says, "What do you mean? Of course he does. He does it absolutely every morning. You know, I could show you the newspaper that where he did the Sudoku puzzle this morning." I think these activities become so ritualized that Sudoku is part of a routine for him. It's what he does after he goes out and buys his newspaper, and the Sudoku puzzle is in a particular place, on a particular page, in a particular font. And another difference, they all look the same to me, but they don't to him. And it's that generalization that I think is so key to what our semantic memory is all about and what these patients are really lacking. So this is Raquel Sanchez, who's, as I say, a neurologist in Barcelona. I'm nearly done. Conversation before testing. This is the patient who had the digit span of 9 and 6 and who had couldn't name anything. So we did see her for about a year and a half, and she then was untestable. So she's coming into the testing room to see us, and her husband, who has brought her, is disappearing off down the corridor, and she says to us, "When is she coming back?" So the message here is the disintegration of sex or gender knowledge. I know most people in the world don't distinguish between these things anymore, but I'm a dinosaur and I still think sex and gender are different. And my question is, what's degenerating here, the knowledge of sex or the knowledge of gender? And either way, it's a puzzle. I mean, I suppose it's slightly more a puzzle if it's actually knowing what sex somebody is rather than knowing that we use she or he to refer. But they both seem so fundamental. It is such a shock to hear somebody, and it's her own husband that she's referring to as she. Here is perhaps my most treasured example, because I think it's such a mystery and so fascinating. This patient and his wife went to have dinner in a Chinese restaurant every Friday evening. And this particular Friday, it's about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and he's already pestering her. "Can we go now? Can we go to, you know, have this Chinese meal?" And she tells us later, and he says, "Can't we go out to eat now?" And she says, "Darling, not yet." And she points at the clock on the kitchen wall, and she says, "We go at 7 p.m. And then she walks out of the room. And a little while later, she comes back into the kitchen, and he's standing on the kitchen table, moving the hands of the clock to 7 o'clock. Partial knowledge again. And why is it a puzzle? Because it's such a striking example of both understanding and not understanding. He knows he can read the clock perfectly well, and he knows it has to be 7 o'clock to do what he wants to do, but he doesn't know that moving that clock to 7 o'clock is not going to make it 7 o'clock out there in the world. Okay, summary. First of all, some of the phenomena that I think we sort of understand, or at least we have hypotheses about. The selectivity of the disorder, despite being a dementing condition and therefore progressive, the atrophy and the hypometabolism. And one of the striking things about semantic dementia, in contrast to, say, a condition like Alzheimer's disease, is that the hypometabolism is pretty much coincident with the atrophy. In other words, it's not a very diffuse disorder. It's really, for a long time, pretty much confined to the anterior temporal lobes. So the damage is pretty selective and the disorder is pretty selective. The very graded nature of the deterioration, if there ever were graceful degradation, I don't know how graceful it is, but it's certainly graded. Profound anomia, that is not word-finding difficulty, good number skills, maybe we understand that. Typicality effects, absolutely rampant, affecting everything that the patients do and say and know and understand. The specificity or levels effect, the fact that, you know, knowledge that is shared amongst many exemplars is relatively robust because it's reinforced by the other things you know, whereas very specific things like shaving your face, and the invasion of semantic memory by autobiographical memory. In other words, when the general knowledge, the ability to generalize amongst things is lost, the things that you do and say every day come to sort of replace this general semantic knowledge. And the phenomena that we are really still groping to understand, the deterioration of gender or sex knowledge, the relationship between semantics and syntax, problems with people and their names, whether that's just specificity, occasional partial phonological or first letter knowledge. Is that just more semantics, that you know a little bit more about that concept and therefore you're somewhat more likely to know what letter it starts with? And most of the examples of this that I've heard the patients offer themselves when they say it starts with an M or a B seem to be proper names. University of Manchester, Bush. Why that should be, I don't know. Maybe that's somehow a more salient feature of a proper name than of an object name. Partial geographical and size knowledge, this fascinating lack of generalization and words in context versus in isolation. The fact that, you know, somebody can say, you'll be euphoric and not have any idea what that word is. The benefit of personal exposure, on what and how much could we see this in terms of expertise? I've been underwhelmed by how much expertise in at least a late acquired field like a profession, how little that protects that knowledge. You know, this surgeon who's completely lost his knowledge about surgical instruments and so on. And the clock example, the mixture of understanding and not. So my thanks to John Hodges and Kate Dawson, who's the research nurse in our Cambridge Specialist Dementia, and to the patients and their carers for allowing me these opportunities to observe, and to you for listening and I hope discussing. Thank you.